Hi, this is David Evans, and in this video, I'd like to ask you to think critically with me about the recent successes in behavioral design and to start to consider some of the ethical standards to ensure that that success is sustainable. So I work at Microsoft in the Customer and Market Research Group, but these are my own ideas that I developed in conjunction with my 30 master's students in the psychology of UX courses that I've been teaching at the University of Washington since about 2010. In my work, I've always applied my academic time in psychology to help humanize our products and decide our business goals. And at this point, we're starting to look closely at right and wrong. Now, ethics is not an area that scientists go into hastily. We're taught to tease apart truth and falsehood rather than right and wrong. But I can ask the question of, is right better for business than wrong? And I think there's enough theory here to hypothesize that that is the case. So the story of behavioral design starts in 2010 with another mainstream social cognitive psychologist by the name of B.J. Fogg. And he developed what came to be known as his Facebook course at Stanford. So in it, he counseled his students to move beyond just cognitive psychology when designing good apps and tech experiences for users. And in fact, one of the things that he emphasized quite a bit was motivation, and just asking his students to think about what would make a user want to continue with an app and what would make them want to continue to stay engaged. Well, during this course in 2007, he encouraged his students not to just take his word for things, but to test them out by building their own apps on the Facebook platform, which at that time was really burgeoning. And as it turns out, his advice was fantastically successful. Over the course of the semester, 16 million people were using the apps that his students had made. And this number ultimately grew to over 24 million. Some of the apps were somewhat serious, like alternatives to internet radio. Others were somewhat farcical, like Send Hotness. One app reportedly started making students over $3,000 a day in ad revenue. But the app that really took the cake was one that was developed by the student in the class, Mike Krieger, working with a developer, Kevin Systrom. And what they launched was an app they called at that time Send the Sunshine. And as we know, that later went on to become Instagram. Now, Instagram is very much a great success story of behavioral design. As we know, it was acquired by Facebook for $1 billion, and this was before it had ad revenue, and actually even before Facebook itself went public. But the bet seems to have been made on the design of this application and its appeal to millennials. So Kevin and Mike were not the only success stories in the class. Some of the other folks include Tristan Harris, who went on to Google, Justin Rosenstein, who's largely credited with really turning the like button on Facebook into the extremely motivating element that it is. Ed Baker worked at Facebook and then went on to optimize the Uber app. And a lot has been written there about how behavioral design is used to help encourage drivers to keep working. And finally, also in the class was Nir Eyal, who published a book titled Hooked, How to Build Habit-Forming Products. And this has become a business bestseller. So in some ways, the success of behavioral design was really shown just by the success of the students. But if you fast forward to today, then what we're starting to see is a bit of a disagreement between some of the colleagues who were in the class. Tristan Harris has founded the Center for Humane Technology and has started to gain a lot of attention with TED Talks and so forth, talking about whether or not these UX choices were really the ones that were best for users and most sustainable. So, for example, he called out that maximizing addictiveness was really just a function of introducing a variable reward schedule, something that psychology has known about since B.F. Skinner. But in doing so, Tristan Harris argues that several billion people now have a slot machine in their pocket. He goes on to debate against the counter argument that, well, users have willpower and they're able to put things away. And what Harris has said is this misses the fact that there's 1,000 people on the other side of the screen whose job it is to break down the self-regulation that you have. Well, his comments stand in pretty stark contrast to those of Nirial, who argues that people do have the power to put this stuff away, from social media to casual games and so on. And they always have. But when we preach powerlessness, people believe that too. Well, this schism that's developed and the success, and really in many ways now, most of the folks in this class are now asked to answer tough questions from the media and so forth about the ethics of this behavioral design. And I think that it all signals that it's high time to really think about this and think about it carefully. Well, I myself published a book on behavioral design in 2017. And, given the success of Hook, I had let's say, a farcical conversation with my publishers. And they said, well, why don't we just, give the market what it clearly has signaled that it wants, and let's just call your book Addiction by Design. But it was taken, somewhat thankfully. Now, I said, well, why not we just give, designers a book called Evil by Design? Is that what you're saying they really want? Fortunately, that was also taken as a title, and so really we had to turn back to really the roots of behavioral design, which is thinking about things from the user's perspective. So we ended up going with a title called Bottlenecks. And this single word for me summarizes the user's experience with many tech experiences. And that is that, we come equipped with powerful neurological constrictions that we use to discriminate between meaningful tech experiences and those that are some level a waste of our time and a waste of calories. And so the focus on Bottlenecks was to really go through everything we know from psychological science and acquaint designers and engineers with those aspects of their users. In many ways, I wrote the book with the same motivation that Nirial did, and of course we're collaborators, and he recommended this book on the back cover of mine. And that was to make sure that entrepreneurs out there have a chance. We do know that on every platform, be it voice skills, be it app platforms, Facebook, smartphones, what have you, there really are a massive number of apps that are offered to the market in the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, even over 1 million on the case of iOS and Android platforms. But a very, very small few actually go on to experience any kind of success. So understanding the bottlenecks of the users is really simultaneously understanding some of what you're up against in users and also understanding what users use in order to protect themselves from exploitation. Let me expand on this issue just a little bit further. So the first bottleneck that was introduced to the public came from Google, who said, look, there's not just a moment of truth when people are opening their wallets and deciding to pay for what it is you're offering the market, but there's a very important moment of truth when they even direct their attention to you. And at the time that search marketing was really gaining speed, it was hard to dispute this. Now, why is this a bottleneck? It's because obviously there are so many things. There is a wealth of content and a scarcity of attention, and that means that more content will be bottlenecked and blocked out and not attended to than that will be. Well, not long after Facebook introduced its second big moment of truth, and that's the question of motivation. We know that 80% of smartphone apps, for example, are never launched again only 5 days after they're installed. And so the motivation bottleneck is the question of, like Nirial's book, have you hooked users? Have they become habitual users? Are they engaging, many times every month in addition to just every month? When I stepped back and thought about the many UX and market research studies that I've confidentially delivered over the course of my career, and when I matched this against really the entire spectrum of human psychology, what I realized is that there are in fact 6 big bottlenecks that really determine whether or not tech experiences survive and journey on in the lifespan with our users, or whether they are blocked out and disregarded and abandoned, very much like what they would be with attention and motivation. So this is what the book summarizes: attention, perception, memory, motivation, self-image, and social influence. Now, mind you, these are not the terms that our users use. With attention, what they'll tell us is that, oh, I didn't even look at it. And this is the kind of thing that summarizes what we now know about ad blindness, for example. With perception, really it's that they thought it was something else. For example, when people think that something is noise, they won't attend to it. They'll block it out. This could be noise email or noise advertisements, noise notifications. The forgotten bottleneck, the memory bottleneck, people just say, well, I probably saw it, but I don't even remember. It's good to say that they forget memes and experiences, but the truth of the matter is this might even be too flattering. They can't forget what they never encode in memory in the first place. And then finally with motivation, the users say things like, well, I checked it out, but I didn't really get into it, and they abandon it. But no, it moves on. The self-image bottleneck goes like this. People say, well, this thing wasn't for me, or it did nothing for me. And so it was time to put it away. And of course, many of our brand trackers look very closely at that question. Do people perceive that Apple is a brand for them? Do they perceive that Instagram is a brand for them? Do they perceive that Microsoft Office is a brand for them? Or something that doesn't match their self-image and something that they won't engage with? And then finally, the last bottleneck is social influence. And this is the one that we measure with the question of, would you recommend an experience to someone else? Would you promote it versus detract from it? Now, each of these, mind you, is just as brutal as attention and motivation has been from the beginning. But what we've since learned working with my students is that this understanding of psychology has led us to a statement of ethical design which can help to decide and help UX engineers and UX researchers to make good and bad choices and to see the boundary between them in their day-to-day work. So if we accept the top part here, that users are equipped with these powerful bottlenecks, which they use to decide whether or not they're going to be receptive to certain experiences or not, then the argument is that the more aggressively your UX design choices overpower or sidestep any single bottleneck, then the more likely it is to be blocked by a subsequent bottleneck. That's the hypothesis, and that's the statement that says, look, why wouldn't we just do everything we can to gain attention? Well, and the answer is there, which is, if you're really aggressive there, then you might get caught up and be perceived as something that is not informative, that is noise instead of signal. And if you're very aggressive there, then you might get caught up at a later bottleneck. So you and companies risk unethical design choices anytime you incentivize certain KPIs that focus on some of these bottlenecks like attention and motivation and ignore others. So the only really ethical behavioral design is whole person design. Users are humans, not merely eyeballs and fingertips. You need to design and you need to incentivize and you need to track as a company the entire spectrum of human neurology and human behavior and really your customer's lifespan with your product. And that is to say, at least realize that you need to survive all 6 bottlenecks in order to keep to retain your customers. So this is kind of taking that and putting it in really more of a condensed form. The argument again is, if you're overly grabby in trying to gain the attention of your users, then you're going to be perceptually labeled and then ignored. So if you try to deceptively resemble the content that your users are looking for, then you're going to be wiped from memory and forgotten. So if you repeat what you're doing and then try to use fear to overwhelm folks' rational thinking, then eventually you're going to be abandoned, and that the motivation to continue with that channel won't. Well, you can try to design in addictiveness, as Tristan Harris calls it, and try to bypass self-regulation. But eventually your users will really regret the time that is spent with your experiences, because it doesn't match their self-image. It doesn't perpetuate their own narrative. So, if you're obstructive about their choices there, and most particularly if you obstruct them leaving to choose a different platform to meet those same needs, then you're going to bring out the trolls. And the trolls are those that, as I said, will really detract from a meme and do that in a very public way, and be very damaging overall to a brand. Now, that type of polarization and that type of extreme discourse on the web are some of the behaviors that platforms have profited from, and that might be the last-ditch effort to stay relevant. But over time, we were seeing, and more and more UX designers are becoming concerned that if this erodes our social norms and institutions too much, then we'll simply invite regulation. Okay, so now you've heard the thesis, and I'd just like to fly over a few examples so that we can kind of get a better sense for this argument. So, for example, we're all very well aware of a very grabby, attention-grabbing design that comes from your average animated ad with very, very bright, hot colors like red. These are all things that are designed to trigger our orienting reflex, and they have done so since long before tech was involved, and even going back to our prehistoric times. But understand exactly how you react to aggressive UX choices like this, and that is that you eventually and actually quite quickly learn that this isn't meaning, and so you direct your attention elsewhere. And we're very good at perceiving some blocks on our screens as being the content that we're looking for, and others as being noise. Well, the next aggressive thing that you're seeing is, auto-playing videos together with their sound. This is another thing that can really grab your attention, even if we're on a different tab, say, or if we're not even looking at a browser and looking elsewhere in our desktop. But again, you yourself can probably attest that you very quickly mute this tab now, and that's a functionality that is now ingrained in Chrome and Edge and most browsers. Well, so this impairs other types of warnings. For example, in Microsoft Office, which I concern myself with, we have a variety of these same type of warnings that are brightly colored and should be very attention-grabbing. But, as you can probably attest, they are quite often ignored and quite often habituated to. So, metaphorically, you just have to understand that everything that your users are experiencing are very much like what Professor Robert Kelly did as he was trying to give an interview to the BBC about North Korea, and his children, came running in the door. Metaphorically, this is exactly how your users
the question is, how do democracies respond to those scandals?
Experience these
and what
grabby
would it mean
attention.
for the wider region? I think one of your children has just walked in. I mean, shifting sands in the region. Do you think relations with the North may change?
I would be surprised if they do. Pardon me.
The distractions can only mount, and in the metaphor here, this is our arms race to gain the attention of our users.
What's this going to mean for the region?
And yet,
My apologies.
despite the embarrassment, we're very equipped to focus.
South Korea's policy.
Well, the next place that we're really going to see this arms race play out is with most browsers are now enabling desktop notifications. So if you are at a particular website and you allow them to show you notifications, you do not even need to be in a browser. And this is, taking a page from, smartphones to say, how can we attract people's attention, back to the app? So this is exactly the kind of place where we're going to see most likely a lot of really aggressive choices, and that will eventually result in our users perceiving the entire channel to just be noise. So moving on in this tale of aggression, in this tale of unethical UX design choices, if you're tired of being, experiencing the blindness of your users, then eventually what you can do with your monetized content is just resemble the core content that they came toward. And if you look on your average editorial journalistic website, this is the Seattle PI. What we're now seeing is the choice that was made in the last couple of decades to advertise sponsored content and to treat it in our UX design very similarly to how we treat the core content, the editorial content that our journalists are attempting to make, every attempt to be truthful. And so by displaying both as a thumbnail and a title, we've made the choice to have these be perceived as quite similar among our users. And every publisher platform is equally guilty of this. This is the NewYorkTimes.com. Now, there's some indication that is given of what is paid for content, but the question and the review that we can all do is to go through and say, well, just how noticeable did we make that? Just how much did we empower our users to discriminate between signal and noise? And the closer that these have gotten over time has created this very troubling vulnerability. So what has come to pass, and again, this is both on editorial sites as well as social media, where the advertising content is treated in its UX exactly the same as the core journalism or as the core social content posted by our friends and our peers. We've created this vulnerability whereby at this point we know that agencies outside the U.S., in particular the Internet Research Agency funded by folks with political motivations in Russia, were posting all sorts of memes all over the web around the 2016 election, and they've been subject to I think dozens of indictments from the Department of Justice, including a very recent one. Even though the Internet Research Agency has had its accounts disabled or deleted on Twitter and Facebook and so forth, we know that they haven't gone away. The Department of Justice just created another indictment, and in it they documented that actually the Internet Research Agency has doubled its budget in the first half of 2018 from what they spent in 2016 and 2020. And so this content is going to be flooding our social media sites and flooding our programmatic ad campaigns. And really, to take a really close look at some of them, the sophistication is quite something. So here's one made to look like a Hillary for President ad, but it's not. And what it's saying is simply, look, if you text Hillary to this number, you can vote for her. Well, in the United States, that's not true. You can't vote by texting. And so this is really, in many ways, a directed effort at voter suppression. But the next layer of the deceit and the perception goes from the fact that this is retweeted by someone who would appear to be a Trump supporter. And the person is saying, hey, not fair, Hillary voters get to vote via text. And so, psychology has long known that once you put the us versus them overlay on this, people stop thinking critically and they stop thinking rationally and really listening to that voice of doubt inside them that says, really? I'm not sure you can vote by texting. But at this point, they're going to become quite persuaded by it. Now, in certain markets, in certain zip codes, these ads were done with African American actors and models in it. They were done in Spanish language, and then they were targeted to specific zip codes in battleground states that could really affect the outcome of the Electoral College vote. And so, this type of sophistication and this type of organized trolling is something that we can only expect to continue. But I do want to point out that, it was ultimately UX design choices that made this vulnerable. To not signal in any ways, in sufficient ways, that these type of memes are motivated and represent not really objective truth, but a certain perspective. Now, just quickly touching on the memory bottleneck. One thing we really have to realize, too, is something that Daniel Kahneman pointed out, And he, of course, is one of the great cognitive psychologists who won a Nobel Prize in behavioral economics, and has a wonderful book out for a few years now, Thinking Fast and Slow. And the thing that he points out, and the real danger of this, is that if people repeatedly see these type of falsehoods, then the other thing that will happen is, just because they are more familiar, people will increasingly perceive it to be possibly true. And really, the very dangerous thing here is, even though I pointed out that you cannot vote for someone by text message in the United States, just because it has become more familiar to you, and again, if you're mindlessly scrolling through a feed and not deeply processing everything that you're looking at, you're going to be more likely to believe it's true. And so persuasion happens in many ways because of the traces left in memory and the sense that something like this is more familiar. So the vulnerability is very real. Okay, well, moving on to thinking about surviving the motivation bottleneck. How do you, encourage your users to continue to return to your application, continue to launch it, and then once they've launched it, to engage with the content for longer periods of time? And what B.J. Fogg pointed out, again, I alluded to earlier in this talk, is that really this is just a function of putting in a couple of reinforcement schedules whereby there's an unknown amount of time until reward is available for you. And this is the kind of thing we know in the business as fear of missing out, right? This is the kind of thing that motivates people to return to an app and launch it and check. But then to also mix that with, once people have launched an app, the unknown amount of actions until that reward is revealed. And in the modern day, that's swiping down an endless scroll. There's an unknown amount of swipes you have to do until you see some content that is truly impactful for you. And this is the kind of thing that Tristan Harris now has said, look, there's a very close parallel to how gambling machines are engineered. And we have now taken a page from that in the ways that we're engineering social feeds. And the social feed adds another layer to it. So, what is in this screenshot? It's simply that little red dot that shows you that there's new content for you to attend to. And, in the business, we call that the meatball. And right now, the meatball runs our lives. Right now, your smartphone in your pocket probably has some meatballs that are showing with a number, a count of some new content that they're asking you to attend to. Well, making this even more compelling is the fact that oftentimes that content represents social interaction from other people. And so it's not just, it's interesting, the type of content that gets you to return to the apps, but it's that it represents a certain social obligation, a certain approval that you should go and acknowledge or even reply to. The other thing that we know about these designs is that you can feed in a lot of noise into these designs because we're already accustomed to seeing things that are more or less compelling, more or less interesting. These type of designs are very good to put in ads. And this is probably really the biggest overstep with the meatball, is that when you say there's new content for you to attend to, and there is no new content from your social network, things that people have recommended, but instead they're asking you to come back and just simply look at an ad. But these have been very effective, and so most parents nowadays are seeing a whole lot of this in their home, and that is, they're watching their teenagers or people of all ages, the parents as well, returning to the devices, and oftentimes spending perhaps more time there than they originally intended. So, a good question becomes, what bottleneck does she have? What neurological moment of truth does she have in order to help her with her regulation? The question really becomes, at what point does she decide that she needs to set it down and seek to fulfill other, perhaps higher order needs? Well, and this is where her own self-image comes in. And this is where, in addition to looking for reinforcements, every human being also is looking to perpetuate their own narrative. They're constantly thinking about the self as they exist now and the self that they want to become. And we're all thinking about the mismatch between those and how we can close those gaps. I think that one of my favorite summaries of this comes from the developmental psychologist Erik Erikson. And what he said is that over our lifespans, you can expect people to try to answer 8 existential questions as they mature. And, many of those take place when we're quite young in the first 5 years of life. But then eventually we're asking, am I good at something? Who am I? Can I share my life with somebody else? Do I matter? And these are some of the questions that are really the last kind of bottleneck and the last bulwark for users to say, am I really getting all of my needs met with the things that I'm engaging with online? And some of the data that has come out, and this is from a National Institute on Drug Abuse survey that has been fielded in the United States incredibly since 1975. And so it's the kind of thing that these researchers were accustomed to seeing real stability in these metrics, not big trends upward or downward. But they reported that that since 2007, corresponding roughly to when the iPhone was released, they're seeing that the 12th graders in their sample have declined incredibly in the times per week that they're reporting hanging out with friends, declining in the dating that they're doing. Corresponding also with a sharp leap in their reports that they're more likely to feel lonely. And then, also not getting enough sleep. So these type of metrics are the things that, ask us the question, are the media that we are engineering and bringing to the market, folks in this room, folks who work at companies in this room, are they truly meeting the needs of our users and our young users? Because the metric that really caught the idea of Facebook and others was this, reported by Gene Twenge and others in 2017, which was simply that the more hours per day spent on the use was dramatically correlated with increased suicidal ideation and increased suicide risk factors. Now, you kind of have to ask yourself, if science were to document a curve like this with pharmaceuticals, we would very quickly perhaps pull it from the market and really seek to understand on a better level what it is that we brought. And in fairness, these data were the ones that caught the attention of Facebook, and were the ones that Zuckerberg referenced when he was testifying before Congress. He's saying, what we're doing here is not taking a broad enough view of our responsibility, and realizing that time spent is not necessarily the best for our business, but higher measures of well-being, health, happiness, not feeling lonely, are going to be the things that end up better for the business in the long haul. And really, this is now, acknowledging, again, that full person that our customers are, and acknowledging that if we have really maximized their motivation to engage with us, then eventually we are going to need to answer the questions of their longer lifespan development. They spend a lot of time, I do, you do, we all do, with social media. And eventually we do ask ourselves the question, is this furthering my story? Well, and unfortunately, if the answer is no, then users will eventually move on. And I think that you don't really get into the business of meeting, customers' needs with social media unless you realize that, extinction is a very real possibility at every step of the way in this business. We're not seeing anything close to extinction on Facebook and others, but for the first time, coming into 2017 and ending 2016, we saw that the 12 to 17 age group were now declining on the platform. The drop of 1.2%, again, coming into 2016, went up to 3.4% drop into 2017. We also see that in both the U.S. and Canada, and also in Europe in the same quarter, this was Q2 of 2018, for the first time really in the history of Facebook, you see a decrease in the number of users. This is the kind of thing that would be predicted by something ultimately bottlenecking the application in users' lives. eMarketer points out something also very interesting, which is that they can now measure an appreciable degree of Facebook nevers, those children aging into the tween demographic that appear to be overlooking the platform altogether. Now again, we all know that another way that you can survive is to also acquire the companies that the market moves to. And that brings up another, kind of final issue as you move through this, which is, that if people want to move to a different platform, then increasingly, not only is it ethical, but it's regulated and obligated that we return to them the data. And this is the distinction in the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, between the owners of the data and the processors of the data. And they argue that our customers ultimately are the owners of their data. They're owners of their pictures and their posts and the graph of their friends that we digitize for them in social media. So they have the right not just to receive the data, but the GDPR also says that they have the right to ask us to transmit their data to another controller without any hindrance. Because, of course, just getting a zip file of everything you've ever done on a social media platform doesn't mean that it's all that useful to you. It doesn't mean that you're fully enabled with that utility the day after you receive it. Now, if we prevent that, then and a variety of things, then eventually we get caught up in the last and perhaps most brutal bottleneck, which is we bring out the trolls. And, every one of our companies measures the extent to which our users report that they would recommend our platform to someone else. Every one of us is very concerned with users who go online and detract from our brand. And, you can just think back over many of the PR crises that we've seen in the airlines, that we've seen with everyday fast-moving products, where a misstep is made, and then the misstep can be very, very costly because of the amplification that can go on the same platforms. So the impact on business is very real. This is just data from Attentive, and others confirm it, that a drop in star ratings from 5 to 4 can decrease your App Store conversions by 14%. That's enough to gut your growth plan for the year, or perhaps your entire profit margin. A drop in star ratings from 5 to 3 can decrease your conversions by 51%. This is very powerful. That could potentially even shutter an entire business. So the last bottleneck is certainly one of the ones that's on everyone's mind, which is, when the market turns against a brand, in this day and age, they can turn against it very, very powerfully, and with a very large microphone. The other thing that happens with this level of aggression and with these choices is that you start to have trouble attracting talent. And in this talk, it really cannot go without mentioning that Mike Krieger and Kevin Systrom have now exited Facebook. And what's important about that is their stated reasons why. And really, they are talking about exactly this idea of taking a broader view of our customers and our engagement with them over a longer period of time with really more elevated objectives in mind. And if we're not answering that, then even our best behavioral designers and our best employees are saying, well, it all just felt pretty hollow. They say, selfies and hashtags and all that stuff is great and it helped us grow, but they're asking themselves, what kind of mark do you want to leave on the world? And that has everything to do with thinking about our objective more broadly. Well, that's sort of a tour of a downward spiral, really a vicious cycle of making increasingly increasingly aggressive choices. And I think the important point here is that any ethic of behavioral design has to have built into it a business incentive. Otherwise, it's just simply moralizing. And, that's the kind of thing that I want to draw attention to. In truth, as I've stated, I work at Microsoft. And I've chosen to go to work, under a leader who says, every day your mission is to empower every person in every organization on the planet to achieve more. And, if nothing else, what Satya Nadella is doing is asking us to perceive our goals and the goals of the company and the goals of our customers more broadly. I mean, he's pictured there with the winner of the Chilean Youth Spark Award in robotics. This is Balin Wade. And, on some level, he's right. If she was addicted, she wouldn't be achieving. If she was exploited, then she wouldn't be empowered. And, setting the moral standard at the top is the first step. The second step, as I've been saying here, is to make sure that we're all looking at KPIs that follow our entire user's experience, not just the reach and the DAO and the MAO and all of that stuff. So, are there any examples of coming to make better UX design choices at thinking about the whole person? There are, and some of them are just emerging, and some of them are pretty powerful. So, right there in Windows, we give a notification that says, here is some information we think it is important for you to attend to. But right there in the box, we put people in control and say, look, do you want to see fewer of these notifications? We understand that for you to achieve, we need to treat your attention as a precious commodity, and we need to engage you in helping us to regulate that. The same thing is true for our competitors. In Slack, if you are about to notify the entire channel, and possibly in different time zones, some of them possibly even asleep, then they ask you that little question that says, you're about to do this, are you sure? And I think one of the things that I see around the web and in UX design that makes me believe that we are trying to make better choices is that question, are you sure? The other thing that Microsoft had to do was we had to help out Professor Robert Kelly, and we have to give him a little bit of power to deal with his own distractions. And so in Microsoft Teams, we developed his ability to blur the background behind him.
My apologies.
The embarrassment we can't do much about, but we can at least help him to focus and help him against the distractions that are out there. I'm also happy to report that on platforms such as the Seattle Times, there is now a giant watermark that is placed on all the thumbnails that says, yes, this is an article from our newspaper. And if it doesn't have that watermark, that's just giving our users a little bit of a chance to distinguish between editorial content and promoted content. There's an example actually with Microsoft of, we had an incredibly, this is some years back now, so in Outlook 2007, we had an incredibly sticky experience that had been created, whereby many of our email clients would not automatically download our email from the server. And so, we, for a time, and many in the room may remember this, you had to click the send receive button and then see that little dialogue. And when you were waiting for an important email, maybe it was an offer for employment or something, you would click that send receive over and over and over. Well, by today's standards, this would have been a great feature. It would have had a lot of engagement, a lot of stickiness, and all of that. But of course, if you're thinking about the email user trying to achieve their overall goals, this is no good. And so we developed the toast notification to let people know, look, you've got new email. Hey, we're still garnering their attention, but at least we're eliminating the fear of missing out. Another thing that I'm looking really closely at is that on both the Google platform and on Microsoft, we are empowering our users to review all of the big data that we have on them, from their searches to their their browsing history, to their location history if they use a map. And the most important thing that we're doing on both of these is giving users the power to delete specific aspects that they prefer not to receive an advertisement about. This is the kind of thing where we let people participate in our view of them and let them shape what's understood of them, and really give us some very, very powerful information that can help send them more relevant ads. You know, even BJ Fogg has pivoted his class to now helping folks reduce their screen time with the same psychology that he helped people increase it. You know, the summary here is that we should be asking ourselves the same thing that parents are asking her, which is, you know, if you weren't spending all this time on that device with that media, what could you be doing? And, you know, the question is not for her, it's for us as engineering. Could she be crowdfunding her ocean cleanup campaign? Perhaps that's what I want to go to work and use behavioral design to encourage. Could she be putting music or her writing fan fiction or videos and uploading to the web rather than consuming them? Maybe that's what we want to promote. Could she be teaching artificial intelligence to be more empathic? And perhaps that's what we want to encourage. I think the same thing we ask from her is what we should ask from themselves. Well, this is the final slide, which just summarizes much of what I've been talking about. A simple sort of do's and don'ts. And what I want you to understand is that ultimately taking a broader view and designing to the whole person is a decision that we have to make. In the decisions and sometimes the tough decisions we make as UX designers and UX researchers, but also in the leadership of the companies that we work for. So thank you very much for your attention.